Hi, everybody. My name is Liz Duggan. Welcome to the OpEx Webinar. We're coming to you live from New England, both myself and my guest today, and we're so glad that you carved out an hour of your day to spend with us. So let's get into it. A little bit about me. My background's in marketing, business administration, and graphic design, but I've been with the Institute for just about 10 years now. So last year we decided that both myself and Tim Healy, one of our senior faculty members, would share the duties of hosting the OpEx webinar. So to me, today I will be your host. If you're looking to get in touch with us to learn a little bit more about our webinars, if you have any questions for either myself or Jonna, you can go ahead and reach us at webinars@instituteopex.org, and our webinar support team will be happy to get back to you. If you're listening in live, tomorrow we're going to email you a link to the YouTube account we have that will be featuring this webinar on replay. If you haven't heard, we run a series of live training events. We have one that's focused on manufacturing, one on the office, and one that's for both audiences, both office and manufacturing, that talks about implementation. We're coming to various cities throughout the U.S. We actually had one in London last week for our international audience. Dates and locations are on screen. The other thing we're working on is we are relaunching our services we'll be offering next year. So we put together a brief survey, and we're asking participants to take a couple of minutes and complete it. We're going to ask you things like, what topics do you want to learn about? Do you want to learn about them on a live webinar, a pre-recorded webinar, an online training, videos, podcasts, that sort of thing. So if you're one of our active members, please take a couple of minutes to complete that survey, because we're using that research to really develop our programs for next year. We actually just sent a link out, if you're listening live, to all live attendees. That's a link to the survey. Next month on the OpEx webinar, we're going to have Jerry McCool. He's going to be talking to you about how OpEx can prepare your business for tomorrow, and that episode will be happening on June 21st at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. All right, on to today's broadcast. I'm very much looking forward to today's broadcast. When we developed the OpEx webinar last year, most of our content focused on case studies. So in planning for this year's series, I wanted to sort of broaden the scope of conversations we're going to be having on the OpEx webinar. And one of the things that I really wanted to bring in is a topic about women in engineering. And very quickly in my research, Jonna came up. She's the president for the Society of Women in Engineers, and she also is the program chief manufacturing engineers for Pratt Whitney. And she's going to be talking about why inclusion is important in engineering. So without further ado, here is Jonna.
Thank you very much, Liz. Let me get to my PowerPoint. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jonna Gerken, president of the Society of Women Engineers, and we're going to be talking about why inclusion in engineering is good for business. Why am I qualified to talk about this? Well, let me give you a little bit of background. I grew up actually in New York and went to a high school named Lawrence High School. And in my senior year, I was fortunate enough to be able to take a drafting class. This wasn't something that many girls did at all. The class itself wasn't very large anyway. The school is not very big. And so understandably, I was the only woman in the class. But I did enjoy the class so much that after talking to the instructor about different options, it was suggested to me that engineering would be a good way to go. So of course, after applying to a bunch of different schools and actually thinking I was going to be an architect at first, I ended up at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute up in Troy, New York, where I majored in industrial and management engineering. While there was the first exposure I had to gender inequality, because we only had about 1 in 4 or 5 students who were female. Since this was mostly engineers at the school, there were very few non-engineering majors. It was the first time I really had to think about the impact of my gender on my career. The first thing I did when attending the first organization I joined at Rensselaer was the Society of Women Engineers. And I'll talk a little bit more about that afterwards. But after graduating with my degree, I moved to Connecticut. So a new state with no family or friends there for my first job after school, which was for Colt Firearms. It was also my first exposure to manufacturing. Being an industrial engineer, I really didn't know where I was going to end up. I thought maybe consulting or one of the other various industries that we ended up in. I knew manufacturing was a possibility, but I didn't really think about it that hard and really didn't take any classes during my undergraduate to would have prepared me for it. So I entered into Colt as a young, newly graduated industrial engineer into a rotation program that they had just started. And I was one of only 2 participants, the other one being a young man from a different school. So I first entered the manufacturing world, which was still, unfortunately, more like what we traditionally talk about as dirty, dark, and dangerous, the 3 Ds, because the company itself is so old, and the building it was in seemed almost as old. And I embarked upon my beginning of my manufacturing career. I dealt with every different scenario you can think of, lots of different machines, lots of different products in the firearms industry. However, the one thing I was not prepared for was to be the youngest in the organization by a significant amount. When every operator I talked to looked at me as if I was their granddaughter. Fortunately, though, I used it to my advantage and was able to get a lot of information out of the operators that someone else might not have been able to by listening, empathizing, and taking the time to come up with solutions that the operators could embrace. A few years into my career at Colt, after several rotations into different parts of the organization, I found myself getting an MBA. Again, back at Rensselaer, however, we have a campus in Hartford, Connecticut. So I was able to be surrounded by a bunch of folks who worked for this other company called United Technologies Corporation, which honestly I had never heard of. I had heard of the products that they make, Pratt Whitney engines, at the time, Sikorsky helicopters, Carrier air conditioners, Otis elevators, etc. And the people I met at the program were really excited to be working for the large company. So I eventually made my way over to Pratt Whitney in East Hartford, Connecticut. And to make a very, very long story short, I have been there 18 years and have had a variety of different positions while there. I was been in manufacturing as well as on the engineering side, being able to see both sides of making a product from start to finish. Currently, I'm the senior manager of manufacturing, of the program chief manufacturing engineers, the PCME team, where our focus is on ensuring that we have manufacturing readiness for all the components, for all the engines that we provide. And what does that mean? That means ensuring that we identify all the risks inherent in the complicated products that we make, and ensuring that the entire program team understand those risks and makes the decisions that are for the best of the product, for the betterment of the product. During all this time, I've been a member of the Society of Women Engineers. I mentioned I joined in college. It was there for me when I moved to Connecticut and moved where I knew nobody and had no connections. They've been there for me through all the different job changes and different roles. And now that I've worked my way up to being president of the society, I can look back and see the incredible amount of knowledge, experience, learning that I've gained from being a part of it, and also being able to contribute back by being an inspiration to women and girls, not only within the country, but all over the world. As our society has grown to over 40,000 members, many of which are outside of the United States. Additionally, I've been a member of the Institute of Industrial and Systems Engineers, IESE, which is the discipline organization for industrial engineers. And I've had the opportunity to work with that organization on a more local level, seeing as the discipline gains and loses people in it at all during the various economic cycles and through a variety of different programs and different events that we've held. I've also been a judge at the Connecticut Invention Convention for probably too many years to count, where I do get most excited about seeing the young minds come up with new inventions, new ideas, new ways to solve problems that is really at the heart of an engineering mind. These young boys and girls take problems that they have in their daily lives and come up with solutions. And it amazes me, the creativity and the perseverance they have every year. And I'm really excited that this year I'm attending the National Invention Convention on behalf of both the Society of Women Engineers and United Technologies, so that we can continue to celebrate these incredible inventors throughout the country. And I would not have a balanced life if it was only just work. I have also been a proud member of the Simsbury Mother Ducks hockey team for over almost 15 years probably, playing women's ice hockey with some women who are now becoming very close friends. We've been through many things together, some weddings, lots of babies, and unfortunately some funerals as well. And it really is another family that I have in my life. I've also started my own family, and I have 2 young boys who both play hockey as well for the West Hartford Wolves. I have had the honor and privilege of not only watching them grow into very strong and talented young men, but also being able to coach them as well, trying to bring a different perspective to what happens on the ice. Not necessarily just to be the mother figure, the one who's there to make sure that injuries don't become problems or to support some bruised egos, but also to show the young girls that start playing in our program that it is possible to be a woman and be a coach at the same time. So what does this all have to do with inclusion in engineering? Well, on the bright side, more women are graduating with degrees than men overall, and that's great. However, if we look specifically at engineering, that is not the case. Yes, the total number of engineering degrees has been going up. However, the percentage of men and women earning those degrees has not budged in over 10 years. There's still less than 20% of women earning these degrees, and an even smaller percentage of those are minority women. To make things even worse, women are not staying in those careers. They earn their degrees, they work for several years, and then, due to various circumstances, are leaving their careers. There is still a pay gap as well for women in engineering. And this is all within a workforce climate that needs to add over 250,000 jobs for engineers between now and 2024. So it's not only just a problem of bringing women into engineering in the first place, there's a problem keeping them there. And so you might be thinking, well, why are they not staying? I'm sure there's several things you can come up with off the top of your head, but the most obvious ones aren't actually true. And we'll get to that in a moment. But first, what is the difference between diversity and inclusion? Diversity is a little easier to define, especially for the certain types of diversity that we can consider visible. There's other types of diversity that are a little harder to identify. Things like age, socioeconomic background, educational background, religion. All of those aspects of diversity, many of which are covered by law, are protected by law, all of those different aspects make us the unique individuals that we are. They give us a unique perspective that we bring to our problem-solving skills. This differs from inclusion. Inclusion is merely, are we making everybody comfortable? Are we including everyone around us in the decisions we're making, or in the meetings we're having, or in the activities that we host after work hours? We can be completely inclusive of a group that is homogeneous. That's easy. But how inclusive can we be with a group of folks who are different than us? Are we thinking about what other things, what other commitments do they have that they need to attend to? Are we thinking about, is there a holiday coming up that we need to be cognizant of? Are we thinking about, is this the best way to communicate this information? Or are we providing it the training in a way that is the most effective for each one of us? So in some ways, it's easy to be inclusive, and it's hard to be diverse. Some will alternately say, if you can improve your diversity, inclusion will follow. But they are two different things, and they need to be considered separately first, as well as together. And why does this matter? There are 5 things that we can talk about when it comes to diversity and inclusion and its impact on our business. And if we start at the top of the circle, innovation is first. How can we be innovative in the fast-paced business world of today if we're only considering the perspectives of a homogeneous group of individuals? Whether they're all engineers or all marketing people, whether they're of different genders, of different races. It takes an entire team these days to be innovative. And if we're not considering all the differences between us, we might be excluding some great ideas. An example that I like to give uses the example of crash test dummies, which when originally invented in the 1950s, consisted of a singular male dummy. This male dummy was made to a 90th percentile proportion to encompass the largest number of males who would be driving the cars that they were testing. But that was only useful for a little while, because very quickly males were not the only drivers, not the only passengers, and thus not until the early 2000s did the car companies and the safety organizations catch up and create an entire family of dummies to represent the wider range of people who would be driving and riding in cars. And it wasn't until after that that a pregnant female was added, so that a woman and her unborn child could be protected in the event of a crash. If we had stayed with that male dummy only, based on the biases that existed at the time about men being the only ones driving, would we have all the safety features that we have today? And would they be as effective on our children and our babies, our elderly and infirm, and those with various other unique conditions? If we move around the circle to business performance, I mentioned we need high functioning teams. How well can a team that is not diverse or not inclusive work when the pressure is on? How well can those teams perform if a key perspective is not included? If you don't include the manufacturing engineer in the design of a component, how can we ensure that the part can be made? If you don't include the marketing team in a business case for a new product, how can we ensure that the product will be successful? And if we don't include the perspective of, for example, those with different abilities, how can we ensure that our products will help them if that is the intended audience? When it comes to retention, I said I would mention this later. One of the biggest issues for retaining diverse talent in engineering specifically, and when I'm talking about that, I will refer first just to women. Many of you probably jump to having children, starting a family as the reason that women are leaving. And I'd say that's a pretty good guess. But I'd also tell you that you're wrong, because the top reason for women leaving engineering isn't starting a family and having children. It's a company culture that does not include them and does not embrace their perspective. We'll talk more about that as well. Money talks, and in the end, financial performance is the ultimate goal for most of our organizations. And now there's been mixed research onto whether diversity actually does impact financial performance. And by itself, I can understand how that might not bear the results that we think. However, financial performance is the end result of the rest of this circle, of your ability to be innovative, perform well as a team, and retain your best employees. So I would posit that even if the research does not prove that being diverse is financially good, I would say that not being diverse is certainly not going to help your performance. Because in the long run, making sure your products and services meet your customers' needs, because you have a variety of customers out there, is probably your most important goal. So those customers being happy is something we should be thinking about all the time. And who are those customers? But people like us, people like your employees. People who are different in many different ways and want to see themselves using your products safely and for a long time. So what can we do? Training and education certainly is an easy answer. Most companies have some sort of periodic or one-time training around diversity in the workplace, inclusion, and such. Others have more extensive educational programs, sort of like a certificate, where employees or managers have to go to a series of sessions and discussions, workshops on how to be inclusive, how to be a better manager, how to attract and retain diverse employees. And that's all great. However, training and education in itself is not enough. Sitting in a training or meeting once a year or once every few years is not enough to ingrain those practices into your everyday work. The policies that the workplace has and your ability to influence and thrive within them has just as big of an impact. Are there things that your workplace does, or excuse me, are there policies that your workplace has that are fostering feelings of exclusion for certain parts of your organization? Are you providing equal family leave, both for the mother and the father, for employees having children? Are you allowing all your employees access to the same educational benefits, the same job opportunities, and the same pay? And are you verifying that the policies you have are actually being enforced and are effective, or are they just words on a piece of paper? If you take periodic surveys of your employees, you certainly can measure their engagement and their agreement with the policies that you have. But you can also use your employees to be a positive force for change when it comes to diversity and inclusion. Most commonly, employee resource groups, ERGs, are the way that companies do this. These ERGs, whether they're for women, for African Americans or Hispanic, for veterans, or for the disabled, these ERGs are an essential way to understand the voice of the customer, in this case, the customer being your employees. And not only to understand what their needs are, but to use them as a resource for what needs to change, what policies are missing or need to be improved, as well as a test site, so to speak, for thoughts on what the company might be thinking about doing in the future, to get their opinion ahead of time, and also a great way to look for future leaders. And in the end, role models, whether we like it or not, whether we realize it or not, is something that we all need. Most of what we are today is the product of the role models that we see. Whether our parents worked or not, if you had two parents raising you or one, the teachers that you had in elementary school, middle school, high school, the coaches and other people who you dealt with on a daily basis during your formative years. These were all role models in our early lives and influenced how we thought about our future careers and what we wanted to do with our lives. So hearing negative stereotypes and seeing inappropriate role models, both in the media and television and around us, does have an impact on us. It's even more impactful when we have positive role models for our children. And all of us, those of us working hard every day, are those positive role models. Those of us speaking out for diversity and inclusion are positive role models. And those of us supporting the next generation of engineers and scientists, technologists, manufacturing experts, etc., we're the positive role models to make sure we're encouraging those coming next. So in reality, I talked about family not being the first reason that women leave the workforce. We at SWE have spent a lot of time and effort trying to understand what is going on. We have lots of programs for young girls and young women to get them interested into engineering. We're working very hard. But if they're not staying in engineering, we're making it even harder. We've done several studies over the last few years, and it's been funded by our Corporate Partnership Council. These are 85 companies, most of which you've heard of. Large companies, large multinationals, medium-sized companies, global organizations, and those just in the US. Every major organization you can think of that employs engineers and technologists is part of our Corporate Partnership Council. So they, as a group, decided it was so important that they would fund these research studies on climate and culture of their own companies. Most of the respondents to these studies were their own employees. The climate study looked at unconscious bias and whether or not it was prevalent in the engineering workforce. These biases listed are proven. They exist in the workplace for women and minorities already, no matter the industry or the degree. What we were looking at was, are they prevalent in engineering? Because at first blush, engineering should be an unbiased career. It's pretty black and white. Math is math, physics is physics. There shouldn't be any bias in engineering. But of course, as we all know, the bias isn't from the product or the actions, it's from the people that are participating in it. So women have to prove themselves again and again and again, multiple times more than an equivalent male. And at the same time, they walk this tightrope between being strong, bold women who are also seen as pushy and aggressive, and thoughtful and empathetic women who are then seen as indecisive and emotional. There is always going to be that wall that comes up when you have a child, because somebody still has to give birth to the child. However, women are finding that it's not the physical act of having children that is the issue. It's the mental wall that goes up from their colleagues and their managers and the rest of the company that says, well, now that she has a child, she's not going to want to do this, or she's not going to be able to, and her time is not, she doesn't have the time available to do it, so let's not bother asking anyway. That wall is not of the woman's making, it's made by other people. And it's a bias that inhibits her career advancement. There are age and ethnicity impacts as well. There is bias, age bias. You're too young, you're too old, not enough experience, too much experience. And ethnicity comes into play, unfortunately, where those with different skin colors are treated differently just because of it, even though they have gone through the same training and education as all the rest of us. The one way to impact unconscious bias is to interrupt it. And how do we do that? We have to make a conscious, meaningful, and lasting change to a basic process that introduces bias. Things like blind slates for interviews, removing names from the interview slate. Things like reviewing all your job postings for biased words, shortening them to eliminate the excessive criteria and qualifications that are not part of the day-to-day job, but are items that come up once in a while because women tend to look to be 100% qualified before applying, where men typically will apply with only about 50%. Things like ensuring there is equal leave for both men and women, equal benefits for all spousal relationships, and the ability for employees to feel comfortable taking vacations and leave when necessary, not just when it's convenient for business. Our culture study looked at values, and that men and women not only have different values that they bring to their work, but also that they align differently in importance. Women want accountability from their organization. They want you to tell me what you want, mean what you say, take down the barriers, and let me do my job. And that's a quote from one of our respondents. Mean what you say and actually do it. Be accountable for it. They also don't want to see the company espouse its values, and it sounds great, but in reality, they get stretched. We hear this a lot in quality. We want perfect quality, no excuses. But when it's the end of the month or the end of the quarter, what will we actually accept to get the parts out the door? And not surprisingly, balance. Balance is important to everybody, but especially to women and not just those with family. Balance is important for everyone's mental health, physical health. As I mentioned earlier, hockey for me is part of my balance. Being part of SWE is part of my balance. I would also say that even though it makes my life balance now, it also makes me who I am. It is the reason that you hired me. It's the reason that I still work for you, because it gives me the perspective, unique perspective that I have. I hope that was a sufficient yet brief overview of why diversity and inclusion is important. Both of those studies are available on the SWE website, research.swe.org. They're very extensive. They have lots of data for those of you who like data. And they, in some ways, are enlightening and concerning. They will give you some other ideas on what you can do to impact your workplace, culture, and climate to be more conducive to women, but also to all employees. Thank you for your time. I hope this was informative, and we have some time for questions.
Thank you so much, Jonna. That was incredible. As someone who keeps an open ear to the broader women's movement, I found that there were a lot of familiar facts that resurfaced, but I was also quite taken back by just how much the industry is impacted by this. And I want to read one excerpt from the executive summary from one of your reports. It's about what's commonly referred to as a backlash, where people feel that maybe women are getting an unfair advantage. And from the report, it says, while 16.8% of the comments made by male engineers express the view that diversity is threatening the quality of the profession and that women now have an unfair advantages or similar sentiments, only 3.6% of male lawyers made these kinds of comments in a similar survey. So that to me was striking, just how much engineering is being impacted by this. Do you have any thoughts or comments about why this may be happening in engineering as if it's not happening in other male-dominated industries?
To me, it goes back to the comment about engineering being fairly black and white, right? Math and physics are what they are. So I believe it's the men thinking, well, we're doing the same work. You know, how is it that we're giving women preferential treatment? Because when we talk about data and engineering, it's very easy to put those blinders on to say, you know, engineering is engineering and data is data. But it's these other biases, these unconscious biases that are inhibiting the women from making it. They're getting the same grades in college. In fact, I've heard anecdotally that women are actually getting better grades in a lot of these courses. But there's so few of them that they don't have the support network to ensure that they can graduate and make it through the whole curriculum, or they don't have a support network, you know, to do homework with, or they're more willing to go to talk to an instructor instead of just working it out themselves, and it might be seen as being weaker because they have to go ask for help. So those kind of biases that are the difference between just being an engineer and being a female engineer.
And that's kind of the perfect segue. In preparing for this webinar, I reached out to my list of contacts, and I was introduced to a young process engineer named Erin, who lives right here in Rhode Island. And I was talking to her a bit about this topic and what her experience has been. Now, she works for a company. She has 6 people within her engineering department, and that does include senior leadership. And one of the things that she kept coming across in our conversations was she felt like in meetings that she couldn't be assertive as the males were because she was the only female and she was also not as experienced. She seemed to lack a bit of confidence because of those 2 factors. So I'm sure there's going to be plenty of women listening to this that may feel the same way as Erin did. Did you have any advice or tips you would offer women in this position?
Sure. Certainly, a coach or a mentor would be very helpful. Somebody that she trusts in the company, but not necessarily in the organization, that she can talk to about how she feels and what are some coping strategies for it. Not everybody can just say, okay, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna speak up. But maybe there's a few questions that she can have ready for whatever the next meeting is that she can ask that are basics. The beauty of being a new engineer in a group is that you're not expected to really know about what's going on in the organization. You're supposed to ask questions. You're supposed to be learning in a learning mode. So come up with a couple of...
Somebody say that would help her a lot too. Just getting that sort of confirmation from somebody in your position would probably go a long way to build her confidence.
Absolutely. So yeah, being able to say, you know, when we have interns a lot over the summer who come in, and we don't assume they know anything other than what their basics they've learned in school, but we don't assume they know about company culture or the organization or the 1 million+ acronyms we have for everything. And so we make sure we take the time to have them ask, write down some questions that you want to ask later on in private, and maybe those become questions that can be asked more publicly the next time you're in a meeting, because you sort of know the answer already, but you want to get it confirmed. This is also where organizations outside of work, such as SWE or a discipline organization, are valuable for finding not only folks in the same position, but the folks who have been there just prior to and can tell you what they did and how they became more confident. Never in a million years when I was back in high school would I ever have thought that I'd be leading such a large organization and speaking in front of thousands of people confidently. But here I am doing it many years later, and it was something I never thought I'd be doing.
That's a good point. And yeah, that's great advice to young people starting out. I think that a lot of times young people, they expect a lot from themselves, whereas, that's not always the case. People, are, willing to train them and bring them into the corporate culture, and I think that's pretty good advice. We do have a couple questions that came into our audience I want to get through. One is, what can women and minorities do for themselves when the employment environment is not supportive and not equal?
Certainly, well, it would depend on the industry. So there are certain industries that are less equal, right, and less conducive to employment, but there's plenty that are. So if you need to change industry, do it. The need for engineers and technologists is great enough now that you should not be scared to change jobs, change industries, change roles. Very few folks that I know that are talented individuals of any gender or race are unemployed for very long at all, and many have jobs before they leave their old ones because there is such a need for talent. If you encounter a hostile environment, say at an interview, don't be afraid, and I'm going to say this with a little tongue-in-cheek, don't be afraid to burn that bridge, because chances are, you're not going to want to work there. Why would you want to work for a company that is not inclusive or hostile? But if you don't call them out on it, they don't even know they're doing it in some cases. So don't be afraid to say something to them, especially because you wouldn't want to be working for a company like that.
That's a good point. The next question is more about you and your experience. The question is, what other occupations or industries would you suggest that provide the breadth of experience that you have received as a manufacturing engineer?
I'll have to take the easy way out on this one and say that the beauty of being an engineer of any discipline is the fact that it is almost universally transferable to almost any industry. It takes a little bit of work to catch up, like I said, on acronyms and uniqueness of all the industry jargon, but in general, problem solving is needed everywhere. Innovation is needed everywhere. So I'd say it's less about the type of degree that you have from a specific standpoint, and it's more about your willingness to try new things and to learn about new industries, because engineers are everywhere. They're in every industry and in every, basically every company you can think of.
The next question I think is a bit of a fun one. Someone wants to know, you've had so many roles in your career. What has been your favorite?
This might come up.
I was thinking maybe the hockey,
Well, that one is fun. Can't get paid for that one, but
right.
It's a toss-up. I'd say one of my first favorite was a role I had developed with a new team. So we were, this was, I forgot how many years ago now. For when we were developing the engine for the Joint Strike Fighter, I was on a team that was brought together brand new. I was the lead, having never done it before, but we were going to be designing some parts for that engine using a new material that we have never used in any engine before. So we had to concurrently do the design as well as the product, the material development concurrently. And it was, all of us were, I'd say, newish engineers. Not necessarily all new, but on the younger side from an experience standpoint, with a couple of experienced folks as our, mentors and subject matter experts. We had not only the most fabulous time together, but also we had great successes in a very short amount of time because we were all in it together, and we just made the most of the fact that nobody knew it any better than we did. We were leading the way, so as far as anyone else knew, we were the experts. And so being able to participate in a group like that, which maybe not coincidentally was actually very gender diverse, was really exciting. And I think every person on that team became a manager at some point and is leading others. And that is a little bit of a testament to the quality of that team.
That's
And
awesome.
I'd say, yeah. And I'd say probably my other favorite was probably, it was a very short amount of time, but it has impacted me tremendously, is I had a very short rotation as an HR client manager. So as an HR person in one of our organizations, and learning that side fairly early in my career made a huge difference when I became a manager. I already knew a lot of the little policy intricacies and things like that, and benefits and other questions, but I got to understand how the leadership pipeline worked in our organization. Where were the new managers coming from? Where was that, what did it take to get on that list? So understanding how that all worked really has been very impactful to the rest of my career.
Wow, that's great. And I think we have time for just one more question that popped up. The question is, do you find different views towards women in engineering that vary based on the engineering field, for example, in aerospace versus medical science?
Well, it'd be hard to say personally since I've been in aerospace and defense my entire career.
Sure.
I don't know. That would be a good question for me to ask my colleagues in SWE. I mean, traditionally, field like biomedical engineering actually traditionally is a very high percentage of women. And it may be one of those chicken and egg things, is, because there's more women feel comfortable in it.
Yep.
But I don't know, I do know that it's a very high percentage of women. I do know civil is also pretty high. Industrial engineering tends to be on the higher side. My opinion on that is because it's a lot more forward-facing, people-facing than some of the other disciplines. And women tend to like the relationship part of the careers a little bit more than men. So, but I'm not sure that's a great answer for you. That's a good question, though.
It's a thought-provoking one, that's for sure.
Yeah, no, that's a good one.
Well, I think that just about wraps it up. Did you have any other final thoughts you wanted to share with our audience?
I just want to say thanks for taking the time to listen. That's really what's important, is that you're listening and thinking, and maybe taking the conversation back to your organizations to see what biases you might have or other policies that might be inhibiting your progress, and start the conversation on your end.
Awesome. And I want to thank you for taking time to being with us today and sharing this topic. For those of you listening, tomorrow you will receive an email from us that has a link to our YouTube channel where this webinar will be available to everyone. And you'll also receive a copy of Jonna's slide deck tomorrow in the email. But in the meantime, if you have any questions for the Institute or Jonna, you can contact us at webinars@instituteopex.org. And that concludes this episode. We'll hope you join us next month. We'll be talking to Jerry McCool on June 21st at 10 a.m. Thank you so much, Jonna, and everyone have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.